A lot of people don't realize Hamas has a religious ideology that tells it must be in perpetual war with Israel until Israel's destroyed. What October 7th itself meant that there's actually people who really want to kill 8 million Jews and are very capable of doing a part of that already now. And then the response of the world, which is when you're going in tunnels fighting, and it's always horrific to do that, like this level of craziness and irrationality. There's only one conflict that can get hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. Again, let me be very clear. Of course, you can criticize Jews in Israel, but you suddenly understand when this is just wobbling way out of proportion, and this is dangerous.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Rabbi Daniel Rowe. Rabbi, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I had the good fortune to meet you in Jerusalem a few weeks ago at the Aish World Center, where you are one of the chief directors and do all sorts of wonderful things there. We talked about a lot to do with what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Europe. But if you could just first tell our viewers a little bit about what you do, what the center in Jerusalem does, and what your role there is as well.
Sure. So the center in Jerusalem is opposite the Western Wall. So Aish as an organization is there really primarily to connect Jews to Judaism, especially all over the world. People often don't have a strong Jewish identity. We're there to help give people information, understanding, inspiration. And we do a lot of, my role especially in the digital space, creating courses and learning opportunities for people. But we also go beyond the Jewish world, especially where we're stationed here. We become a bit of a hub for diplomatic missions or interfaith groups who want to come and talk at a faith level with us. And a lot of that work is actually not so public. But the faith level diplomacy is another big part of our work as well.
The center in Jerusalem is just amazing. Those views from the balcony and from the windows are extraordinary. So if anyone does have the chance to visit, they absolutely should. You were saying when I was there and we were talking, you were saying that you think that a lot of younger Jewish people are wanting to rediscover their religion. They feel the culture already. They feel a sense of identity about being Jewish, especially younger people in the West who've, often feel Jewish and are culturally Jewish, but some of them are being drawn back into a more religious perspective. Could you say a bit about, and I guess we're seeing something similar with young people being drawn towards Christianity in parts of Europe and parts of the US. Could you just say a bit more about what you think is happening amongst younger Jewish populations in the Western world?
Yes, I think there's probably a set of dynamic processes. One is some kind of generational shift, whereas let's say a generation ago, there was a big push for new atheism and it was cool to be cynical about religion. I think people have discovered there's something missing without their faith, that faith gives in a very deep way, and also heard more voices that might make a more compelling case for the plausibility or rationality of faith. That's on the one hand. And it's also a generation that's been through a lot more. Young people today have been through COVID. And as a Jewish community especially, there's obviously been this eruption of hatred, of vitriol. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of stuff going on. But it's also made people question, like, why us? We get a certain amount of opposition to a war. Everybody hates war and civilians die in war and it's horrific. But the level is just, it feels a bit inexplicable. It feels like, and people are kind of searching into, well, if I'm hated for this Jewish stuff, then what is this thing that I carry that people hate so much? And often they discover, wow, there's something very special, deep to the heritage. And so we see a lot of that, yeah.
That's really interesting that, I guess one of the upsides of the storm of hatred that we've seen over the past 2 years might be a rediscovery amongst younger Jews in particular of their faith and their history and so on. So do you think there's a post-7th of October element to this? Do you think that part of this, I guess, movement or this interest that younger Jewish populations are showing in the material religious ideas of their faith, do you think there's a part of that is a response, as you say, to the things that we've seen in the West since 7th of October?
Absolutely. No question about that. People will say it quite consciously, and then not always conscious of exactly what's driving it, but it's somewhere between a sense of identity, the sense of collectiveness, the hate, the kind of sense for looking for almost spiritual answers to some of the issues that are arising. And yeah, hatred is a very big driver of it. And also the trauma. Just the level of what October 7th itself meant, that there's actually people who really want to kill 8 million Jews and are very capable of doing a part of that already now. And then the response of the world, which is when you're going in tunnels fighting, and it's always horrific to do that, like this level of craziness and irrationality. There's only one conflict that can get hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in the first day of it, basically. And that's awakened something. And yes, the response is not, I would say, we can't just be Jewish because of anti-Semitism and fear. But maybe that sometimes makes people look and explore, and resources they felt they could function without. Like, the world's fine, I'll just sit on my, playing games all day. Suddenly becomes, there's something deeper. Oh, wow.
Let's talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, and that's something that you and I touched upon when I met you in Jerusalem, and I've been writing about it for a very long time, and in particular since 7th of October, because it has just blown up across the West, and sadly here in the UK as well. Let's talk a bit about what you think is driving that. Or I guess let's start off by asking if you were shocked by what you saw. I'm sure you weren't necessarily surprised, because you will be familiar with the history of anti-Semitism and the history of Israelophobia and how those two things mesh together. But I guess, were you shocked by the intensity of what we saw in the West after 7th of October?
I'm going to answer your question as best I can. I just want to say a big thank you as well, because you're writing, I know you're defending Western civilization, but I don't know if you know what it means when you're being swamped with hatred to have rational voices that can articulate things as well as you do. And I know, both as a British citizen and as a Jew, what it means to read the things that you write. So I just want to say thank you. And that's on behalf, I'm sure, of a very lot of people. And you probably get a lot of hate for that yourself, but really thank you. In answer to your question, I think we expected crazy waves of hatred. In 2021, when Israel is at war with Gaza, so it lasted a few weeks, I think 250 people died. There were hundreds of thousands of people shrieking hatred on the streets, accusing Israel of genocide. So on the one hand, it was predictable. On the other hand, I think even the level of predictableness to it was still, even that was somewhat exceeded, especially on social media. And I guess we didn't expect it to go on this long. And the longer it goes on, the more it intensifies and the more the hatred, self-replicates, self-justifies. And so we expected something enormous. And I think it even has been even larger than we expected.
And what's your response when people say, because I hear this literally every single day, whether I see it on the internet or I hear people say it to me in media discussions, people will, and you will have heard it too, they will say, look, we're just criticizing Israel. We're not expressing racial hatred for the Jews. It's not an argument that I buy, particularly for the reasons you've just touched on there, which is that, it's funny that it's this one country that seems to wind people up so much. That's a very curious phenomenon. But what do you think when you hear people say that the idea that there can be this neat separation between criticism of Israel and the kind of anti-Semitism we've seen over the past 2 years in particular?
Yes, I think anti-Semitism is sometimes an unfortunate word, and it's sometimes confusing to people, because in the West, there's a sharp division between race, religion, nation. The Jewish people are not as sharply divided. And a lot of people, I think, when they say I'm not an anti-Semite, means I'm not racist. Find me the person born Jewish who emerged from a Jewish mother into the world and hates Israel, and I love them. So anti-Semitism historically always is Jew demonization. It's taking the collective Jew and finding ways to take the most demonic things and attach them together. And today, the collective Jew means the state of Israel. That's just how it manifests. The majority of Jews pretty much now live there. It is the only Jewish nation state in the world, and for the last 2,000 years. So that is the collective Jew. And once you start to throw things like genocide, apartheid, and every horrific slur at it, then and especially when it's absurd, again, and I'm somebody who has deep sympathy with Palestinians. I work a part of my, I do work in dialogue and try to do what I can to bring peace. And I want to see one day if we could ever get to a two-state solution. I don't know how right now, but one day, please God, everyone living together at peace with dignity. But, even some of my Palestinian, when we're discussing friends talk, is like, why does the world say it's a genocide? I mean, they will use hard words and harsh criticism of Israel. But a genocide means you're trying to exterminate a people, and here 99% of the civilians are alive and 90% of Hamas is destroyed. So that sort of thing is so irrational and so mass. It's like this mass hysteria of bizarre irrationality. And yes, when Russia went to war in Chechnya, Russia was really brutal and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. You didn't have hundreds of thousands of protesters in London. When When America and Britain, when we were fighting with the Iraqi army to destroy ISIS, and we killed tens of thousands of civilians. The Kurdish intelligence says 40,000 people were killed in Mosul alone, and there were only 4,000 ISIS fighters. And we understood. There was no hundreds of thousands of protesters. People understood war is brutal, and even if you're trying to be precise, Israel 2021 is just the best example. There was 250 people died in that war, hundreds of thousands of protesters, people screaming genocide. So you see that it's nothing to do with the number of civilians. That effect is simply Israel being at war. And yes, individuals may be swept along with the crowd, but the crowd is deeply Jewish country demonizing.
I really agree. And to me, one of the most striking things is that people were calling Israel's war on Hamas a genocide from the very beginning. I mean, literally on the 8th of October, 2023, people were already saying this is a genocidal response because they'd already decided that Israel is a demonic entity that loves to kill Palestinians. That's essentially what they were saying. Of course, you will be familiar with this, that anti-Semitism is a shape-shifting phenomenon, isn't it? It kind of changes over time in history and molds itself around different ideas, all to the end of demonizing the collective Jew, as you say. How important do you think it is for people to understand that, the changing nature of anti-Semitism?
I think it's critical because if you don't understand the historical pattern, you never really quite realize what you're in. I always bring to people the example of money lending. Jews were often actually forced to be money lenders. They couldn't own property and were excluded from lots of professions, and countries would bring them in for economic development. And then money lending became like this crime against humanity. And you can understand why people don't like money lenders. They come knocking on the door asking for interest. But then when the Jews were kind of sidelined and the Italian banking families took over and Jews were kind of placed in ghettos, there was no mass movement against Italian banking families. Now it became, we hate the people in ghettos who spread diseases, like a trading society. And then when Jews were out of the ghettos and started doing well, now we hate you because you're taking over. So it's very shape-shifting. And I actually say one of the things we failed in Holocaust education is we always wanted, we meaning all of humanity, wanted to pretend that some kind of monsters just emerged in Germany and took over society and, no good people were involved in it. And the actual story I know from my own grandfather and when he left in the early 30s is it wasn't like that at all. Good people were being swept along with the belief that Jews have this unique demonic destruction of Germany in mind and had manipulated the whole of World War I. And what started fringe began to penetrate the legal system, academia, journalism, mainstreaming slowly, till people who'd once defended Jews start thinking, oh, I don't know, maybe there is truth to it. And it's when you understand how the shrieking, howling demonizers take over a society and good people get swept along with it and genuinely go on anti-Jewish marches and we don't hate all Jews, we just hate that kind of narrative, and you just see it playing out. Then again, let me be very clear. Of course, you can criticize Jews in Israel, but you suddenly understand when this is just wobbling way out of proportion and this is dangerous.
One thing that strikes me about Israelophobia, which is a word some of us use, sometimes I use it because you're not quite at liberty in the British media to say what you really think, which is that a lot of these people are anti-Semites. That's my honest held view of some of these people who have an obsessive hatred with the Jewish nation. But Israelophobia is quite clearly the latest manifestation of this. And one thing that strikes me is that a lot of the things that people used to say about the Jews, they now say about the Jewish state. The bloodthirstiness, the global power, the desire to kill children. We hear the phrase baby killer all the time in relation to Israel. I mean, it is interesting how even if the justification for hating Jews changes, the kind of underlying view of them kind of stays pretty similar, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think, you could try and explain it spiritually. And as a religious person, I might have some spiritual ideas behind it. But I think even on a more natural sociological level, one can't avoid the fact that the Jewish people appear in the foundation texts of Christianity and Islam. In fact, for the Christian Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament are basically stories about Jews. The Quran is really a story about Jews. The most frequently mentioned person in the Quran is Moses. So that really allows for two broad social interpretations. One is what in the Christian world is called Judeo-Christian, like kind of seeing them as very connected. Maybe Judaism was a original root, and then Christianity became this tree that grew from it. And you could say similar about Islam. Or you could say, no, these are the rejected people, and their very existence, hurts on some level, and especially their return to the land of Israel. Whoa, that's either prophetic or demonic. And that kind of narrative of this special place for the Jews in the narrative, and they're either good or bad, but you have emotional, very strong feelings, was also inherited by the communists, even though officially they kind of removed religion, but they kind of replaced that old demonic Jew and put it right back at the center. So a lot of the narratives of Western political and social and religious ideologies and the Islamic world do already have models of where the Jew goes, and demon is one of them.
Yeah.
And the proclivity to say, if I've got a problem in the world, it's the Jewish people's fault, is very deep. And there's no doubt that today you see it amongst young people who are at home with struggling, hard to get jobs. They went through COVID. They're, prospects are not as good as the parental generation. There's a lot of upset and anger. And somebody turns around and goes, the Jews' fault. It just awakens some kind of dormant social pathology and creates this wildness all over.
I mean, I don't want to get into any individual names or anything like that, unless you want to, of course. But one thing that concerns me, I mean, I've been writing about left-wing anti-Semitism for a long time, because in the UK context in particular, that was the key issue over the past decade or so. The Labour Party for a period of time, I think, had a lot of anti-Semitism in it, and I hope they're still trying to sort that problem out. But we've seen the rise recently of a right-wing anti-Semitism as well, or a return of a right-wing anti-Semitism, particularly in the American context. You now have individuals, I guess I will mention a name, people like Nick Fuentes, who is a classical anti-Semite. He's open about the fact that he hates world Jewry, he hates the Jews. You have that going on alongside this kind of anti-Israel obsession amongst the left and amongst the so-called liberal classes. I mean, it has. What do you make of that rise or the return of a kind of right-wing anti-Semitism and the influence it's having, especially in the internet?
Throwing social media into it is like, it's like this toxic mix, and then you kind of throw a bit of fuel onto the fire, and algorithms that are designed to evoke outrage and, and sometimes a bit of manipulation of them, especially at the beginning of this conflict with China and TikTok and so on. Yeah, it's a scary thing. I have spoken about this already years ago in America, how there's a lot of complacency. To assume that it can't emerge on the right is a huge mistake. It's dormant and can emerge anywhere, everywhere. So I think you're hitting a very deep nail on the head. As I said, it's very interesting because since you mentioned Nick Fuentes, he did have a fascinating discussion recently with Tucker Carlson that created this explosion, and rightly so, outrage. But it was interesting that the end of their discussion segued into the depressed situation of young people. And Charlie Kirk also once was asked what he thinks about the rise of the Nick Fuentes stuff, and all both of them talked about was pornography addictions. And we shouldn't underrate that segue. Depressed men sitting at home, addicted, whether it's to substances or to pornography or to whatever it is, whose lives feel helpless, are the exact target of the global virus of anti-Semitism. They are the people who are most dissatisfied with society, are the ones most likely to latch onto. It's that collective Jew is the demon. And you get these hilarious, like, we give too much money to Israel every year. You could debate whether America gives too much, but what America gives to Israel is 0.05% of the federal budget. Like, if you remove that, it's not like you'll solve America's problems. And meanwhile, it gives more to South Korea, it puts soldiers on the line in Japan, in Europe. Somebody comes along and says, I want to get rid of all of it, fine. But it's the Jews. No, it's the Jews. It's that. So yeah, there's definitely a lot to be concerned about. At the same time, and I don't want to always be negative, history has also taught us that in the short run, evil can do terrible things. And as a Jewish community, we can suffer a lot in the short run. But in the long run, societies find ways for good to prevail. They do. The voices like yours and like others that perhaps feel a bit marginalized, the minority at one point, do exist and do speak to the sane and the rational. And hopefully now with the war subsiding, hopefully it's subsiding. Hamas is trying to stay in the game, says Hezbollah, says Iran, but please God, it will subside. The voices of reason hopefully can come back into the mainstream and society can return to normalcy again.
I share that hope, actually. And I think the optimist in me thinks that pretty soon we will look back on this 2-year period as one of hysteria. I hope, anyway. I hope future historians will wonder why we went so mad after 7th of October and failed to do what we should have done, which is offer full support and solidarity to Israel in its war against that army of anti-Semites. I do think that reckoning will come at some point, I hope. I want to ask you about Israel itself. It's my view, an unfashionable view, that Israel itself is a source of optimism. I was there recently. I visited you guys in the beating religious heart of Jerusalem. I was also in Tel Aviv, and I was in the south, talking to people in the kibbutzim who had been attacked by Hamas. And the sense of resilience, I thought, was extraordinary, which is not to say people just bounced back. Obviously, there is trauma, the scars run deep, people are still reeling from what happened on 7th of October. But the resilience, I thought, was really, really striking. And I wanted to get a sense from you what the atmosphere in Israel is like at the moment. Obviously, this war has taken a huge, enormous toll, but is there still a sense of camaraderie, a sense of connection? Are people still in it together in the way that us outsiders who are pro-Israel might hope that they are?
It's so interesting because Israel, on the one hand, is very unified and on the other hand, very fractured. And I think that's a certain irony of the Jewish people, perhaps throughout history. Pre-war, the country was in the middle of tearing itself to pieces, really over its constitutional issues and fundamental questions like who we really are as a people. And there was, like in a lot of parts of the Western world, politics has become camps, tribes that don't trust one another. The beginning of the war really unified people and reminded them that what unites us is a lot stronger than what divides us. The whole dilemma of hostages versus the priority of fighting Hamas and diminishing Hamas's power versus getting the hostages back kind of divided again or produced not as strong as pre-war, but certain fractures. And since the hostages of the living hostages are all home and almost all the dead ones, that's also gone down again. But my perception, just walking in the streets, talking to people, taking taxis, is the unity is outweighing the disunity. And you pointed about resilience. So my wife's grandmother is a Holocaust survivor, and she always struck us as somebody of immense resilience, but also immense optimism. And, she used to say it, but really, you don't survive 2,000 years through a lot of persecution, exile, without a lot of either having or evolving a lot of resilience and a lot of optimism. And also, thousands of years gives you a perspective. I know it sounds very funny. I'm not 1,000-year-old, a few decades in the world, but we do come with historical consciousness. We have a national memory of all these. And the optimism was always true. The fear of what can go wrong is always, unfortunately, true. But the optimism is true. The goodness in humanity does prevail, sometimes in the short run, sometimes in the long run, but it always comes through. And the Western world is built also on a wisdom of millennia and ideas like, separating religion as states, so keeping politics and certain things apart, the rights of the individuals, the rights to say outrageous things. All these things are in the end good and values that in the end make a better world. So the idea, hopefully, yes. So both, I think Israel's full of this, all the things you described, tensions, traumas, but overall a stronger sense, I believe, of unity, a unity with ourselves now and with ourselves in the past and future. And a strong sense of optimism. That, however, I tell you an amazing thing. As you point out, I sit in an office opposite the Western Wall. So lots of groups come to visit the Western Wall, Jewish and non-Jewish, but Israeli groups, even in the war where planes couldn't get in that, they come. And the religious come and the secular come and everybody comes. And halfway through the war, I started to notice, and lots of groups sing. Jews like singing. So they come, whether they pray or not, they all sing. And there was one song every single group was singing, and it was the most popular song in the whole of Israel. At the most difficult parts of the war, the hostages were still in Gaza, the world opinion was going crazy. Everything was, soldiers' lives were being lost. It was terrible. And the song they would sing is, God loves me, and it's good, and it's going to get better and better and better. And you were looking, this wasn't like crazy. These are people whose families, whose brothers and parents were in Gaza, and many of them didn't come back. And people who had lost relatives and people, and they're not saying we're naive about the world, but we trust the world is basically good and it's going to get better.
That's extraordinary. And something I often think myself, I trust that the world is good, which can be a difficult thing to do sometimes, but that is my kind of underlying view, even though I'm not a religious person. But in relation to world opinion and Israel's attitude to that, does it cut through in Israel? So I'm thinking, for example, when the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans were prevented from coming to Birmingham recently, and it caused a huge storm in the UK, rightly, I think. I think that was an anti-Semitic decision. Do those kinds of things cut through, or the weekly marches at which people say Israel is the most evil state in the world? Do they cut through in Israel? And what perception do ordinary Israelis have, do you think, of the Western world? Do they just think it's lost the plot? Is that how they see it at this moment in time?
I think a lot do. And actually, I think that can have a negative effect the wrong way, because sometimes, on the one hand, it's quite good to be able to not be impacted too much by everyone's criticism of you. But I think sometimes people just give up trying to explain. And I think this war was an example where Israel put in far too little effort, even to helping its allies out there. Sometimes it would take weeks to respond to a wild accusation, partly because, like, okay, those who hate us are going to hate us. So some are sensitive to it. The majority, I think, just say, okay, we know there's been lots of haters in history. We know there again. I wish there was something a bit of, I think there's a lot of people in between who are like, okay, we don't need to, we should always be self-critical. We should always, and after the war, there's got to be investigations into everything that happened in the war. And as humans, it's very likely some things were immoral that happened and they need to be investigated. But we don't need to internalize everybody else's hatred. But we should also understand there's a lot of neutral people being bombarded with horrific lies and horrible scenes that are true. And the obligation to explain ourselves, not to just, you see, there's this kind of, do I need to get you to approve of me, tell me I'm good? And there's a healthy rejection of that. But I think there's also a healthy, once you're past that, saying, okay, but let's tell you what is going on. So that people being bombarded with this on the media and people who are open-minded can get the other perspective they need in order to say, okay, I get this. It's not nice, but they're behaving it the way we would. They're trying to keep to the highest ethical standards. War is horrible. So I think it's a shame there isn't a little bit more of that. But I think broadly speaking, most Israelis, at least, are not too affected by the Stockholm syndrome where I'm telling them how evil they are.
Good. That's good to hear. And don't internalize the West's hatred. I think that's a really important message. Okay, Rabbi, my last question for you is, because I know you've got lots and lots to do. We hope the war is coming to an end. Hamas is doing its best to keep it going, and there have been lots of skirmishes and attacks and so on over the past few weeks. But what is your hope about what will happen next? Do you think the war will be successfully wound down? Do you think some kind of deal is possible, or will it just take a very long time, given everything that's happened over the past 2 years?
A lot of people don't realize Hamas has a religious ideology that tells it must be in perpetual war with Israel until Israel's destroyed. They use the code word Palestinian state, but they mean the whole of Israel. So I said, we'll put down our weapons when there's a Palestinian state. But their definition of that is the whole of Israel's become a Palestinian state. So they will keep fighting till they're forced to stop fighting. But there may be methods people are talking about, like just rebuilding the half of Gaza Israel's in, and as more and more civilians move into that, then be able to end Hamas. My hope is, and I believe this will happen, I just don't know how quickly, is that peace with the Muslim world and the Arab world will be possible. And once that happens, there'll have to be a lot of reconciliation, a lot of process. I mean, this war's been going on since before the State of Israel began. The drive to try and drive the Jews out of the country began in the 1920s. There's pain and traumas on both sides. Palestinians have actually suffered more overall than Israelis have, but it's not a comparison. Everyone's suffered, and there's a lot to work through. But I believe 50 years time, and look, we're also in a world that is speeding up at an incredible pace. The next 30 years are going to see more technological, which means also the ability of more social and political revolutions than maybe the last few thousand years. So a lot of good could happen quite quickly. People are talking about expanding the Abraham Accords. Kazakhstan's come on board. I know when we meet imams in this building, and some of them are the usual suspects, so the kind of outliers a little bit, it might call it more liberal or left-wing in the Muslim world, but some are not. And some do it on condition of anonymity. There is a thirst to find ways to build peaceful relationships that will eventually allow the politics and pain to be overridden. And again, I don't know how quickly it will happen, but I'm sure it will eventually happen, that this will be a region that becomes a beacon of goodness in the world.
Rabbi Daniel, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.